Welcome to the next installment of Opinions of Value, Valkyrie's very own virtual chat series. We're glad you could join us for today's episode. This series was created to encourage open and honest dialogue about the health and state of the commercial real estate industry through the lens of commercial appraisers. On Opinions of Value, we will explore everything from the trends shaping the commercial real estate market at large to challenges impacting the way valuers conduct their jobs in the digital page. We are excited to dive into today's episode with an amazing panel of guest speakers. Please welcome Ross Lightenhouse, CEO and co-founder of Taxonics and managing partner and founder at Calvary Real Estate Advisors. Returning guest, Desiree Flannery, MAI, manager with the Property Tax Commercial Group at Ryan. And finally, returning guest, Casey Conway, MAI, CRE, CCIM, principal and co-founder at Red Shoe Economics. Let's dive into the questions, shall we? Desiree, please lead us out on this question. Why is it that property tax consulting, tax appeals, and appraisals for property tax purposes represent such a prominent segment in the commercial real estate industry?
At the end of the day, it's expense management, so it's ensuring that our clients are not paying more property tax than they're legally required to do. In particular, in states that don't have that three-legged stool of sales tax, income tax, and property tax can represent a significant portion of your revenue as a percentage. And so as professionals, we're proactive in staying on top of all the ways that the outside environment is impacting our tax authorities. For example, and I know we'll talk a little bit more in depth about this later, but in Washington State, there's a bill that's currently not gaining momentum, thankfully, that essentially would try to tax wealth as a collectible under property tax. And so it's important to understand that. And really, at the end of the day, our responsibilities are to help our client meet their financial goals.
Ross, do you have anything to add to this question?
So it is the single largest line item operating expense for a property owner. So when you talk about the importance and the significance of real estate taxes when making investment decisions or operating real estate, it stands out. And if you don't manage it appropriately, it can kill a deal. You know, and I'd mentioned in the introduction the amount of time that we spend helping real estate investors and developers not only manage real estate taxes, but also forecast those real estate taxes. I think that type of insight is probably more important to the industry now than it ever has been, especially when you're seeing rising interest rates, deterioration and erosion of value. There's just as much importance placed on kind of the reactive solution, which is appealing assessments, as there is the proactive, which is understanding real estate taxes. And I think, as most people know, you've got over 3,100 different taxing counties in the U.S. and then thousands of different taxing jurisdictions inside of those counties. Each one of them assess and tax real estate a little bit differently. And so it's very, very difficult for commercial property owners at any scale to really get their arms wrapped around exactly how their properties are going to be impacted by real estate taxes on an annual basis. And so that insight now, again, is more important than ever. And you kind of touched on something that's really interesting, Grant. You had talked about kind of fee appraisals, transaction appraisals declining. I think I read a statistic that on the commercial side, at least leading up to COVID, there were close to 60,000 commercial real estate transactions a year taking place. I know that that's significantly less now. So there's a lot of opportunity for appraisers and valuation experts to get into the game. But here's a really interesting statistic. I'm actually currently on a 3-state property tour right now, visiting shopping centers up in Connecticut, New York, and New York City. And I'm sitting in the office of a friend of mine who's also a property tax attorney. Won't name names, and borrowing their office. But we were having a conversation over lunch, and there's an interesting statistic I think that he and I both agree on, and that is there are probably fewer than 2,500 full-time real estate tax consultants working in the United States today. folks that are multi-generational that have that expertise like Casey are a rare breed. And there are more and more folks with that level of institutional knowledge getting out of the game, and it presents a huge opportunity for folks to get into this space to be able to offer this expertise. And when you think about, the 11 million commercial buildings that exist, most of the focus that those of us that work in traditional real estate tax consulting have had has been on that kind of top 20%, right? So the big names, the ones you read about in the Business Journal. There's this entire kind of, missing middle aspect of commercial real estate that are relatively underserved, and that presents huge opportunity, whether it's real estate agents and brokers or appraisers to step in that understand how to value real estate and are willing to educate themselves on the nuances across these jurisdictions to be able to provide those services to the commercial real estate industry. So now is really a perfect time for anyone that's looking to kind of add that extra arrow to the quiver, tool to the toolbox, pick up that side hustle. Already understanding how to appraise and value real estate is 50% of the game. The other 50% is just understanding how the game is played in a particular taxing jurisdiction. So I think it's very relevant, this topic, especially for your, Valkyrie customers, clients, friends, and peers in the industry to be thinking about property taxes as an additional service. And then the last thing that I'll leave you with, because this is, again, very topical for us too, as part of Taxonics, we actually built an online e-course to help train folks to be able to provide these services and also help them to understand how to set up this type of business. So it was kind of pulling back the curtain and showing, some of the closely held secrets and nuances of our industry for them to be able to arm themselves with, relevant education and tools to be able to spin this type of business up. And that's been very well received. And we've had a lot of brokers, real estate brokers and agents who have seen transaction volume decline that are looking at getting into this area of the industry because they see opportunity. They've used this e-course to help train themselves. And so it's really an exciting time if you can consider any time in real estate tax consulting to be exciting. This really is kind of a transitional moment in our industry, especially combined with the current market cycle. And as I've mentioned before, and again, kind of going back to your question, there really is no bigger line item operating expense that warrants more attention from a real estate operator than real estate taxes. And as Desiree knows and Casey knows, when the market is declining and folks are looking at shoring up a bottom line, as a property tax expert, you're everybody's best friend.
So I hear take the proactive approach in making sure that anything you can control on the tax side you do before they actually make the assessment. And then in terms of pressure on the appraisal industry and the opportunities available for property tax appeal appraisals, we're seeing it as well. We're seeing demand from our clients for a very specific product that will help guide them through the appeal process. Casey,
Right.
Do you have anything to add to this one?
I would add just two or three quick things. So number one, remember, commercial property owners are the only entities that are taxed without representation. They don't get a vote. They own around the country. Unlike you that own your home, you're a voting member in that jurisdiction. So this may sound a little harsh, but the assessing authorities really could care less about the corporate owner. They know that they don't vote. They're not going to impact whether the assessor gets appointed or reelected. The second thing is the definition of value is incredibly important. It's different in most every state jurisdiction, and they're supposed to assess in most states the fee simple market value. And as Desiree knows, like with a hotel, you have anything but the fee simple market value. You've got going concern, you've got intangibles. And so it's not just hotels that are in that bucket, but think about self-storage, think about manufactured housing. As you get into this, expand your scope where there's contributing assets that go beyond the fee simple market value and know that definition in the state. And the last thing I would say is the competency provision. This is a specialized, complex area, and you can't just jump in. Ross has got like an education offering to help with you. Partner with somebody because you need to have the competency to know how to go through it. And usually I direct people, go look at the respective state assessing authorities' appraisal guidelines, and you'll be surprised how many things are different than what you've thought in your normal practice. So just those three things.
Grant, can I add something to that real quick? Casey touched on something that I think is really important. His first comments about commercial property owners, taxation without representation, and being from the DC area. I mean, that's literally on our license plates. I think what's really important for property owners to understand is that you were starting to see erosion in market value, and market value, or fair market value, true fair market value, was supposed to be kind of the starting basis from which all assessment valuations take place. So anytime you start to see deterioration in overall market values, you can expect for the assessment base to decline. Well, I've served as an elected official in the past in a small city that I live in, and I understand the pressures to a local budget where property taxes make up more than 50% of your local tax revenue. When market values decline, assessment base declines. All other things being equal, tax rates are going to have to go up to make up for that, unless folks are willing to cut operating costs, which is in some cases a very politically unpalatable thing to do. Nobody likes paying more in taxes, but people also like to have snow plowed off the streets. And so in some cases, you know, the residents' desires to have a quality of life can win out. The reason I mention that is because on the commercial side, what you will start to see, and we saw this coming out of the last recession, assessment-based declines, they need to make up for revenue. So the first place that they look are raising tax rates on commercial properties. And if you look around different taxing jurisdictions throughout the country, you'll see that in some cases there's a distinct disparity amongst the tax rate that residential homeowners pay and the tax rate that commercial property owners pay. And so there's a knee-jerk reaction when the assessment base drops to have to raise taxes to look at commercial first. And it's not just the ad valorem tax rate, which is the tax rate applied to the value. It's also non-ad valorem rates, which in some cases may come from a different taxing entity. You know, could be a business improvement district, could be like City Center District in downtown Philadelphia. There's a whole bunch of examples of that. And so one area where commercial property owners need to be cognizant is that even if they see an assessed value drop and they think, wow, I dodged the bullet, that actually represents the decline in the market, they may come back and get hit the other way with a rising tax rate. And so from a budgeting perspective, that's one of the questions, one of the things they need to be thinking about as they're planning for real estate tax liabilities and expenses going into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to touch on Casey's point real quick, the need to have a mentor when breaking into the property tax appeal space. I have the privilege of working with someone with more than 2 decades of experience specializing in that, and it contributed vastly to my ability to navigate that entire situation. It's not like typical fee appraisal, that's for sure. All right, let's move on to the next question. Ross, I'm going to ask you to kick this one off, please. There's been a lot of disruption in commercial real estate over the past few years. First due to the pandemic, and most recently the sharp increases on the market interest rates. What are you seeing in terms of the activity level itself for property tax appeals, and how long do you expect those conditions to persist?
Okay, so from a high level, activity has definitely increased. The activity really spiked right during COVID. Then it declined a little bit, and now with rising interest rates and properties going upside down, we're starting to see that activity increase as well. In terms of length of time, I think that appeal activity is going to remain above average levels for the next 18 to 24 months. So that's kind of the short answer. If you want to dig into some of the specifics about property type and particular jurisdictions, I'm happy to dig into that. We're looking at data and information across hundreds of jurisdictions throughout the country, all different property types, and we spend a lot of our time gathering information and data. So if there's something in particular, Grant, that you want to drill down on that you think might be of interest to the listeners, I'm happy to talk about that. But that's kind of the high level answer.
Well, I do appreciate that high level answer. We won't get too granular on this one. Desiree, you're in the trenches. What are you seeing? What is your activity level compared to, say, this time last year?
I think COVID obviously brought on a lot more in the appeal world, primarily just because of tax law, values tend to lag. So in 2021, when I'm reviewing 2020 values and everyone's talking about the COVID pandemic, that data value was 1/1/20, 3 months before it hit. And having to explain that to clients, challenging conversation. So those conversations haven't really stopped, especially in the hotel world, because certain markets, and there's of course a lot of press, which brings about more questions, talks about how hotels recovered so quickly, but that was really only in certain markets. In other markets, they still continue to perform below where they did in 2019, but the assessors just read the articles and pull the data of those transactions that were record beating and use that as a reason to increase values substantially. And depending on the jurisdiction you're in and that having to overcome that preponderance of evidence for successful appeal outcome, we don't necessarily have great data to show if the jurisdictions aren't willing to look at the individual properties and are only interested in looking at the market as a whole. So that can be really challenging. But I do think there's always good opportunities for appeals, even in a good market, because assessors can get more aggressive with increasing values, and we have more data to show them that they're incorrect. So it's busier now, but it's always a great time to look at that, no matter the market.
Well, thank you so much. Casey, I know you are active and across the entire U.S. in this space. What's the activity level for you, Ben?
Yeah, so it's elevated, and I think Desiree made a really important point. Most clients thought because of COVID they could appeal their 2020 taxes, but the appeal value date is January 1, so it hadn't been declared. Most everybody spent a lot of money. It would have been important for us as experts to explain that to clients, and so really 2021 was your first bite at the apple. But I'm dealing with more cases that even predate that we're dealing with industry changes, whether it was retail. I'm still dealing with big box retail, but we're dealing with 2017 to 2020 valuation dates that are working their way very slowly through because a lot of the appeal processing courts were shut down in 2020 and 2021. So knowing those retrospective dates, where I always start and remind people that are in this business is always start with a state of the industry around your property type. So what's happening with hotel? What's happening with office right now? So the office is, this whole remote work issue. We're not even half of us are going back to work. It's going to have a bigger impact if you're an urban office building than a suburban one. You're not going to have transactions. So you may need to use a band of investment technique to get your cap rate because there aren't transactions. The assessors generally will take shortcuts, and they'll try to do one approach to value and just be the sales comparison, and they always are looking in the rearview mirror. They're never looking forward. So I think as you're doing this and you're getting into this work, understand by property type what's happening in that industry. So self-storage went into an overbuilding cycle pre-2020. So a lot of that inventory is now being delivered today, and we're seeing occupancy and we're seeing rents decline because of that. Office, understanding the whole remote work evolution, it's not a COVID issue. It's an industry issue. The big box, the retailers, we're still already announced over 1,500 big box store closings this year from entities like a Walmart. So how do you explain to the judge or the hearing panel, how e-commerce affected, big box retail? So the phrase I use on retail and office right now is remote work will be to office building values what e-commerce was to big box retail. It's amazing how many hearing officers understand that kind of a statement or whatnot. And the other one I say on the data, the assessors, they're dealing with mass appraisal. They're dumping lots of data in. They have no idea how a CoStar data works or how a TREP data works. And so you've got to be careful to dissect that data and know what they're using. I had a case in Denver where it was in the popular Cherry Creek shopping center district area and had a property that was outside of that. And so the assessor just grabbed all the CoStar comps in the Cherry Creek shopping center area and assumed all of them were retail deals. Half of them were office building and hotel rent deals above the retail place. So they were using $30 to $50 rents for retail that had collapsed. And so the way we figured that out is in the code within CoStar that determined whether it was really an office lease versus a retail. Assessor had no clue. They had no training on any of that stuff. And that's, again, where our value comes in, really knowing the data resources that you're using. We're seeing the opportunity be broadening to more property types. Like I said, self-storage, manufactured housing. We're even going to see for rent subdivisions, which are really horizontal multifamily opportunities. Those, the private equity's pulled out, the land's dropping. Public home builders are seeing, like a KB Homes, a 68% cancellation rate. How do you revalue that land? A lot of the assessors just do a retail value. They don't understand discounted cash flow, and that you can't, just the market value is not all of that. So broadening to more property types, understanding that date, understanding that definition of value, I think are really important.
I think, yeah, I want to add to that. I think this is important to understand for anyone that's considering doing tax appeal work or representing folks for tax appeals. I mean, you're telling a story about a property. I mean, in a million different ways, it is a story that you are telling. And so broader market conditions certainly play into that. And part of that challenge, I think that Casey mentioned, is that, in the absence of really good data, high transaction volume, rising market, that's easy, right? For assessors to appraise, it's very easy. I mean, you're following those trends, tons of really good data. But in the absence of data, things like band of investment, weighted average cost of capital in a rising interest rate environment, when you don't have a lot of commercial transactions that would give you a solid indication of what's an appropriate capitalization rate for a property, that level of detail is what is going to be able to help you tell a better story around the property. One area in particular, speaking of retail, because we spend a lot of time valuing shopping centers, retail assets, mixed use. One of the areas and pieces of data that's been very, very helpful in telling a story, kind of even beyond COVID, and some of it's e-commerce related. Some of it's, frankly, it was kind of amenitized retail that were close to office parks that just, frankly, is not getting the foot traffic. That information is looking at sales per square foot numbers from tenants at a building, looking at sales to occupancy cost ratios, because those are very clear trends that you can show how tenants, certain type of retailers in certain areas of the retail industry have continued to see sales declines year over year, while occupancy costs have continued to go up. And in the retail industry, there are very clear benchmarks in terms of what level of threshold in terms of sales to occupancy cost ratio, once you hit that threshold, where that business is technically in the danger zone and at risk of folding. Or if it's a national retailer, someone in corporate headquarters looking and saying, sales have been declining, our sales to occupancy cost ratio is now above 20%, we need to fold this store. So they back out of a lease early, or they tend not to renew. That type of information is incredibly important. And then the last thing I would say, whether it's office, retail, any one of the kind of major food groups from a real estate perspective, is looking at what the market is justifying from a rent perspective, and not just asking rent, but net effective rent, concessions, TI, all of the stuff that's thrown into to get to a net effective rent. What is the market dictating now versus what are those tenants in place currently paying, that if they're coming up on the end of their lease and that lease rate has escalated at 3.5% over a 7-year period, that rate may be well above market. And so when that tenant rolls out, whether it's earlier on time and they've got to reset that lease rate to something that's maybe 20% below, even if it hasn't happened yet, there's still a portion of that that goes into the story of the property, which is next year I'm losing 20% of my tenant stack. Those tenants are going to roll, those spaces are going to roll back to market. My NOI as it stands today is going to erode by 20% possibly. And so that's going to impact the value, because again, at the end of the day, it starts with an interpretation of what's considered fair market value. And what I love about it is, from an appeal perspective, it's our opinion. Can't be wrong if it's your opinion. Assessor may disagree. But that opinion is, if a potential buyer was to step in on this particular data valuation and pay X amount for this property, that they're going to take into consideration the fact that I'm losing, potentially 20% of my tenant stack, or that rent roll that's going to roll back to market rates, and what's that going to do to the potential value of the property. So that level of nuanced data is huge right now, especially when assessors are kind of fumbling around trying to find, the writing on the wall in terms of what's happening with certain asset types and certain markets. If you can get into that level of granular data, again, it helps tell that story, which is ultimately what kind of gets you across the finish line to win an appeal or get some type of adjustment to the assessment.
Let me piggyback on two things Ross said there. So our job when we're successful in this, I look at this, we're challenged to come up with the answer why. So why is assessor wrong? Why is his opinion of market rent or cap rate wrong? And so what I look to a lot are earnings reports. I read a ton of earning reports. If I'm doing a retailer on Home Depot or Bed Bath & Beyond, even going back, and I did one a year and a half ago, I look at those earnings reports, and those earnings reports, under the penalty of perjury to the SEC, they tell you what is coming at you. And so they'll tell things like, so in one particular one with a big box home improvement center, they brought in when lease accounting was being brought in. And they talked about in the earnings report that, 5, 10, 20 years ago, we didn't care what the lease rent was, not the market, what the lease rent was, because we didn't have to record the lease as a liability on our balance sheet. So who cared? It was a financing mechanism. And being able to dig that out of an earnings report saying that what was influencing those really high rents in big box was the influence of lease accounting, and that I didn't have to put it on my balance sheet as a liability. And now that changing means now they have to pay attention to what is the market rent for just the real estate. So, think about that why questions that you're going to have to explain and where you can go for really good data. So I use things like TREP, I use the earnings reports, I go behind the scenes and bring those in. And that's what really influences, I think, a hearing officer or a judge, which are primarily lay people. They may have some familiarity with residential, but they don't have any experience with the complexity of the subtleties of your commercial real estate. So I think you're exactly right, Ross. And I know, Desiree, you on the hotel side, having to try to explain what a hotel is. It's a business. It's not real estate.